Okay, here we go. So everybody, thank you for being here. My name is Larry Eichenbaum. I am a solutions engineer at HashiCorp, going on about a year and a quarter now. Previously, about 6 years at Chef Software. Been working in the DevOps space for about 10 years, give or take. I've got a number of team members who are here and who have helped me to kick or re-kick off the Hashi user group for the DC, Baltimore, Nova area. I'm not going to read off their names. I'll let them maybe introduce themselves quickly, but I'll just start with Prakash. If you're here and you want to say hello and then pass the baton.
Hi, everyone. Glad everybody's here. I'm Prakash. I'm a SE in the DC area.
And you're passing the baton to?
I'll pass it to, who's it, Yash?
Sure. I'm Yash. I'm a troublemaker located in Falls Church, just east of Tysons, if you're familiar with the Northern Virginia area. I've been with HashiCorp in this capacity for about 2 years, and I was making trouble other places before that, also in the same industry.
And is Manjeet here? I believe you're also a cohort.
Yes, I'm here. Hey guys, this is Manjeet Singh, and I'm based out of Dallas South, Chantilly, Virginia. I've been with HashiCorp for last 2 years as a solutions engineer. And with that, I'll pass the baton to Ranjit.
Hey everyone, this is Ranjit. I'm a SE out of the Boston area. Been with HashiCorp for 3 years now. And yeah, I'm glad this virtual thing is great because we do have Boston events, but they don't always happen too often. So the fact that we can now bounce around between each other's regions and attend different events is cool. And I'll pass it to Nikita.
Hey everybody, this is Nikita Anand, and I am an SE based out of Boston. Just over a month at HashiCorp now, so fairly new here, and yeah, happy to be here. And
all right,
I think Rob is here. I'll pass it on to Rob.
I was really hoping you guys would skip me. So Rob Jackson, been with HashiCorp for about 18 months. I am fluent in sarcasm and immature behavior, and really glad that we're doing this. I'm hoping to learn a lot myself, and really good to share the information on the new product.
And so with that, just a couple quick pointers just as we get this moving. As you can see, we've combined the Northern Virginia and the Baltimore DC hugs together while we're virtual. When we go back to in-persons, we'll probably be splitting these back out for obvious reasons. If you're in Nova, you don't want to be driving into downtown DC or up to Baltimore. And we'll probably coordinate some of the activities and agendas between them so that everybody in the regions can have access to the same information. And moving ahead, here's a rough agenda. I'm not going to read slides to you. Anybody who's ever been on sessions with me, you know that I tell you, you can read yourself. We will be talking to Joe and having him present very soon. And we have our code of conduct. Our code of conduct is, I'm certainly not going to read this to you as well. I'll leave this up for a moment. You can screen grab it if you want to read it right now. Otherwise, you can get this in the recording. We just expect everybody to treat everybody fairly. And if anybody feels uncomfortable in any kind of situation, please reach out to one of those who has their participant name indicated as HashiCorp, and then we will jump in and seek to assist you. Our big goal, reviving the hug for the area here, really is we want to build this back up. And for us to build this back up, at the end of the day, we don't want to be necessarily running and driving this. We want this to be community driven. We want to have members from the local community, those of you who are here, people who come in future sessions.
Total violations, but I'm not sure that's a useful number.
Well, I'm sorry, and if you can mute yourself for the moment, that would be great.
I would change
or Prakash, if you could jump on that. If you have any ideas of topics that you want to present, that you think should be presented, speakers, etc., feel free, jump out, tell it, send it over email, send it over Meetup, whatever mechanism, carrier pigeons if you've got them. We want everything that we do in these meetups to really to be relevant for those who are in the user group. I don't want this to be content by HashiCorp staff because we think it's what you need to hear. We want to make sure it's the things that you actually do want to see and hear. If you want to speak, there's lots of ways that you can get involved as well. We've got links here to both of the meetup groups, the Nova and the Baltimore DC. If anybody here uses the DC Tech Slack group, I know I use that. I created a hub channel in there, so go and join the Slack channel. That makes a great place if you want to communicate outside of Meetup. That way it's more Slack driven, if you will. And if anybody has opportunities or if you're looking for an opportunity, we'll try to help connect you and identify opportunities that we all know of. Again, the DC Tech has a great jobs board and a great network. So if you are looking, that's really a good place to go, especially if you're located in that DC Nova region area. And our sponsors so far, since we're just kicking off again, is HashiCorp primarily. In the past, T. Rowe Price was a sponsor for the Baltimore DC group, and I believe a lot of the sessions did occur up at that location. I'm not certain what will happen going forward when we're back to in-persons. So if anybody is here from T. Rowe Price, if you want to continue to be a sponsor, let us know, reach out, and we can discuss how we can work together as well. And with that, I would like to welcome Joe Thompson. Joe, are you there? Have you got your mic on?
I am here. I have my mic on, or at least I should.
All right, well, we can reach Joe at his Twitter. He's got a Kubernetes Slack handle listed there. Those of us who work here at HashiCorp with Joe know of other ways to get in touch with him too, but we're not going to share that unless he wants to. And with that said, I'm going to end my screen share and turn this over to Joe. And if anybody has any questions on the side, feel free to throw them in the Zoom chat. And with that, it is off to you, Joe.
All right. Let me share my screen here. Now, this is a slide that I kind of whipped up earlier today. And I'm just going to, for those who are not familiar, I'm going to talk for a minute or two about what Boundary is and kind of some of the ideas behind it. And then actually jump into, I have a couple of, like a little toy environment running Boundary in AWS that we can play with a little bit. I didn't get everything done in the demo environment that I wanted to get done, but at least you can kind of see where things were going and enough parts of it work that we can go through and look at how the pieces all fit together. So the core idea behind Boundary is you put Boundary at the perimeter of your network and you authenticate to Boundary as a user, as a client, and then Boundary acts as a proxy for connections into the network that you don't have direct access to. Now, that sounds a lot like a Bastion host. Some people would say, well, I already have, OpenVPN. What would I need with that? The VPN case is more where you want to bring a host in and make it part of your network. So if you want to join two networks together and they're on opposite sides of the planet and you want them to basically act as a single local network, then yeah, by all means, that's a case for VPN. If you just want to give, let's say you have somebody on the road or you have somebody working remote. I mean, I don't know if anybody here works remote just lately, but if you want to give somebody who's working remote access to a single system or, a carefully curated set of systems or web applications in your environment without them VPNing in and being actually part of your network, then that's where you would use a Boundary type solution. One of the nice things about doing this is that because of the way that Boundary works, you can tie Boundary into your existing authentication, not 100% yet. We've got user pass authentication. There are other auth methods coming down the line very quickly because this is brand new. But the central idea is you tie Boundary into your whatever your corporate authentication and authorization systems are, whether that be, whatever you have. And then you basically gain an authenticated proxy to anything in your corporate network, whether it's authentication aware or not, because Boundary takes care of authenticating, authorizing, forwarding the connection to the target. So what we have here on this slide is, all the way on the left, there's you, the user. You have, your web browser GUI or your command line interface, whichever one you feel more comfortable with. And you connect to a boundary controller and you authenticate to it. And that boundary controller internally, and we'll look at a little bit of that stuff on the next slide, that boundary controller internally decides, okay, I know who you are. This is what you're allowed access to. And it gives you back a token. And then you use that token to, make subsequent connections to boundary and say, I want to connect to a specific target. And then boundary will say, okay, you want to connect to that target. Here's a worker that you need to connect to. That's this big green line that goes along the bottom here. So boundary tells your boundary client to connect to a worker that then proxies that connection to whatever that target's going to be. Whether it's SSH or HTTP, there's a couple of other layer 7 application front ends that are already there, and it's extensible, so you can easily write your own if nobody writes one that you need. The worker talks to the boundary controller because, of course, it wouldn't do to have you be forwarded to something that we don't even know if we can trust. So the boundary worker and the boundary controller talk to each other, and they do this by way of this KMS block up here. So the idea is, in whatever key management system you have, whether that be our Vault product or whether it be AWS KMS or some other cloud KMS, whatever boundary allows you to use, you set up 3 keys. One of those keys is used exclusively for workers authenticating to the controllers. And there's this, it's like a 14-step process. I'm not going to go through it all here, but basically it's a communication process between the controller and the worker. They challenge each other. They authenticate that they both have access to the key. They authenticate they're both able to use the key, and so on. So then once those workers have authenticated to the controller and the controller has told the worker, yes, you can trust me, then the controller can forward client connections to the worker, and the worker then in turn will forward them on to whatever the targets are. This root key up in the center, the workers don't use that, only the controller uses that. The controller uses that for encrypting data that it has to store in the boundary database, which is this little, if anybody knows the Postgres logo, that's a Postgres database down there on the bottom. So you can, boundary can use that root key to encrypt anything sensitive that needs to go into that database. And then when it pulls things out, for example, when you're authenticating, it can, use that to encrypt and decrypt whatever it needs to. This recovery key that I have with the dotted line up here, that's a special key. So if all else fails, you forgot your admin password, you forgot everything, and you just know that you need to get into the boundary system so that you can reset things, or you forgot to set things up in the beginning, whatever the case may be. As long as you have access to that recovery KMS key, you can use that as your authentication. So you can actually tell the boundary client to authenticate using that key, not a username and password, not whatever other auth method you have set up. And then it will authenticate to the controller in the same manner as the workers do, using that key to verify that you are who you say you are. And because you're allowed to use that key, you're allowed to do this stuff. Obviously, that's a key you want to protect. You don't want everybody in the world to have access to it. Now, when we start talking, and I'm gonna zoom in this here a little bit. If I can zoom so I'll just zoom in and I'll scroll a bit. So when you authenticate, you are a user using an auth method to log in. Users belong to groups. I mean, this is fairly standard authentication and authorization stuff. In Boundary, users and groups belong to roles. A role has permission grants that determine what it can do. And what it can do might be things that are manipulating objects in Boundary, for example, setting up a new project or a new organization or setting up a new target, or they might be as simple as you're allowed to connect to something through a target. So anything to do with what you're allowed to do in or through Boundary is handled through the grants that apply to your role. Then when you make those connections, and I have the web interface up here that I'll show you in a minute, and we can go through kind of what this actually looks like in the GUI. when you make those connections, you're going to say, I want to connect through this target. It's going to look at the role that you're logged in through and say, is that role allowed to do that thing? Yes, you are, presumably. And then it forwards your connection on to a worker. And the target defines what you're connecting to by means of something called a host set. So you have host catalogs, which are composed of hosts and host sets. So in your host catalog, you'll have individual hosts and you'll have sets of hosts, and any individual host can belong to multiple sets. And I actually have an example of that I'll show you in a minute. So your target is going to connect you to a host set. It could be a single host. It could be any of multiple. If there's multiple hosts, it just connects you to a random one. So if you have a multiple host set, that might be something like a web app with multiple instances. You don't care which one you connect to. You just want to get connected. If you're SSHing to something to do debugging, you probably care about individual hosts. And then what you can do is you can actually say, I want to connect to this host set, but within that set, I want to connect to this specific host as well, not just a randomly chosen one. So I'm going to pause there. Well, actually, I'm going to say one more thing. So organizationally, you have these, I mentioned scopes before. The global scope is every single thing that Boundary manages. Within the global scope, you have one or more organizations. Within an organization, you have one or more projects. That is the extent of the hierarchy that Boundary supports today, at least as I understand it. You can't do like sub-projects of projects. You can't do sub-organizations of organizations. But, if there's demand for that in the future, I mean, I wouldn't say that that's something we wouldn't do. It's not something that we didn't do because we think it's a bad idea. We just haven't done it because it's so early in the development of Boundary. So I'm going to pause there and see if anybody has any questions before I just dive into the command line and the web interface. Anybody? No, oh, I see some chat stuff going on. Let's see. Oh, that's the contact info. Okay. Don't be shy. I want to give everybody a good chance to get to that mute button if they need to, if they have questions. And while I'm waiting, I see hello, Odell, and I think that might be Sam Brown. Hello to Sam. I think that's Sam Brown that I used to work with. So, oh.
Yeah, what's going on, Joe? How you doing, man?
Hey, how's it going? Good to see you, man.
You too.
Yeah. Hello, this is Odell. How you doing today?
Hey, did anybody else make it from your team?
I was trying to see if Billy was going to make it. Hopefully, he'll be joining soon. Richard is on vacation this week, so he's not going to be able to join.
I see David White. I see a couple of other names that I'm pretty sure I recognize. So,
Joe, before you go do the CLI and everything, I will ask a question. If you can go to your first slide.
Sure.
So I'm wondering whether and how this wires into, say I have a cluster running in a VPC and AWS with some nodes in a private subnet and a bunch of nodes some nodes in a public and a bunch of nodes in the private subnet. Can I use Boundary to get into the private side of stuff if I just make sure it's in the right security groups?
Yes, you should be able to. I mean, I don't want to speak for everybody because personally, security groups are where I always tear my hair out the most. But yes, that's the whole idea, right? Is as long as the worker has local, access to the target, you don't have to be able to access the target directly. You just have to be able to access the worker. Mm-hmm. Now, that is probably the most common thing that I found myself bumping up against while I was setting up this demo was, oh yeah, I got to make sure that the target's security group allows the worker to connect because the worker's not in the same security group. So, mm-hmm. Yeah, you do have to make sure that that's set up properly. Yeah, that's the whole idea.
Yeah, and well named, it's sitting on the boundary between the cloud you and the private subnet. So yeah, I can see how that would work, but I wanted to make sure that was in the vision. Yeah,
exactly. And I got really excited when we announced Boundary because, I had kind of we had a code name for it internally that I don't even remember what it was before. But then when we announced it at HashiConf, I had kind of had a background awareness that there was a new project coming down the pike and it had something to do with access. But then as I was watching the announcement, I was like, oh, all those outbound SSH tunnels that I set up from my local network to a cloud instance, I don't need those anymore. I can just set up Boundary and authenticate to Boundary, and then I can SSH to anything I want from anywhere I want in the world and not have to worry about. That's the other nice thing about it is, you know, if it's a tunnel, anybody in the world can hammer on your SSH, but with Boundary doing the proxying, well, they've got to authenticate first to Boundary before they even have a chance to authenticate to the host behind it. So it's nice to have that, you know, linebacker at the perimeter turning away all those bots from overseas.
Don't forget all the PEM keys that we all keep on our lap, or used to keep on our laptops. I'm sure nobody has any of those floating around anymore that are shared.
Oh God. Yeah, I wish I could say that I have never been at a company where there was just a one-pass document with the username and password and everything, but I would be lying if I said that.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm going to, at this point, let me flip over to my tab, and I guess I'll begin, discard this. I'll begin by starting off with, you know, this is right after I authenticated to Boundary, right? I authenticated, I'm logged in as admin so I can see everything. We actually have a, you know, you can choose a light or dark theme for the GUI if you want. You can do basic user admin things from this, like change your password or log out, which we call deauthenticate there. These are the users I have defined. A couple of them are system users, this anonymous authenticated recovery. These are, well, these are users, but they're, the authenticated user is any authenticated user. The anonymous user is anybody who is anybody, whether they authenticated or not. So you can actually provide anonymous access to things through Boundary using that anonymous user. The recovery user, we already talked about that recovery key. That's kind of your ultimate fallback. The admin user, that's who I'm logged in as now. You can go in and I'll just kind of walk around here. So there's a concept of users who have accounts, and accounts log in through auth methods. So if I look here, I have an account, and this is my account here. It's got an ID. And then if I go down here and I look at auth methods, this is the original password auth method, and I can see that my admin account is an account under this auth method. I have another account called app user that I was kind of halfway through setting up and just ran out of time. I was going to demonstrate what happens when somebody does not have access to a target, but yeah, just didn't have time to set that up. But anyway, let's go back to the admin user. So I have this account. The admin user is part of the administration role. So roles, administration, principals, the admin user is the principal. And the grant the admin user has is about the biggest grant you can have. It's any action on anything of any type. Pretty obvious, right? Auth methods I mentioned before. We have, you know, there's the user pass auth method. There are other auth methods coming down the pike. If I wanted to set up a new one, I would say, you know, some demo auth method, save that. And now I can say, you know, what type is that? Like I said, right now it's just user pass auth method. But later on I could add different kinds of auth methods here. I'm just going to delete that method now. Let's see. So we talked about users. We talked about groups. I don't have any groups. I could define an admin group if I wanted to. So you can, instead of assigning a user to a role directly, you can assign a group to a role. And then all the members of that group are part of that role. Let's go back to, I have my generated org, and my org has a generated project. And this is where it starts to get interesting, right? So one thing is, let's take a look. I have several sessions active here. Active in this case, meaning since these are all web sessions, it just means that that I connected through them, because HTTP is a, you know, stateless method. the targets that I have set up, the main targets that I wanted to look at tonight are this app node SSH, and we can look at the host set for that. I have this generic web host set. And so the notion here is I have, let's say, a bunch of hosts running a web app, and I want to be able to manage those hosts in different ways for different users. So I have this target called app node SSH, and the host set is the web hosts. And so the people who can use this target would be allowed to SSH to any of those hosts. But I might not want everybody to be able to SSH. Some people I just want to be able to use the web app. So I have this other target called app node web. It's using the same host set, but if you notice in the details here, the port is different. So the port for the app node web target is 8080. Now if I go back to the app node SSH target, of course the SSH port is 22. So I can define people have access to this, but not that. And so, you know, maybe my admin group gets access to the SSH and my user group gets access to the web. Host catalogs. There's a generated host catalog that just kind of has a little faked up host set and a host. If I look at the boundary controller catalog, I notice there's this one host in here, and there's this one host set. And if I go into the host set contains the one host. That's probably the simplest that you can imagine. Then I have this other host catalog, and it has multiple host sets, right? So one host set is those same web hosts that I talked about earlier. Here they are. You know, and if I were to go into one of these, I could see, you know, this is a particular host here. If I go back to boundary targets generic host set, so that's my generic web, and it has multiple hosts. But if I go back to this other app main, I can see it has one host. It has main 28.122. And the idea there is there might be a specific host that runs different things, right? So maybe I have one host that's special because it's running the Postgres database. So I can put that one host in that special group, and I can also keep it in the, you know, the big generic group for the web app. So let's take a look here over at, I'm going to flip over. Again, I'll pause for questions while I'm flipping over if anybody has any questions or wants to see anything that they're interested in. All right, so let me stop sharing that.
Hey, Joe, just I got a question offhand about a boundary provider for Terraform, and yes, indeed, yes, on the public registry.terraform.com, there is a boundary provider up there now.
Yes, there definitely is a boundary provider, and I think actually we have some pretty nice examples of using Terraform to provision all of these things that I just kind of poured through in the GUI. You can do them statefully, or not statefully. You can do them, you know, in an IAC fashion with Terraform. And one of the nice things about that is you don't necessarily know, for example, you know, in your host catalog, if you're going to give an IP for a host, you don't necessarily know what that IP is going to be until after it's provisioned. But if you do all this with Terraform, then Terraform will take care of that ordering for you, and you can actually use references in your Terraform code to those hosts as you provision things within Boundary later in the sequence. So you can see I have, oh, you can't see yet because I haven't stopped. I need to stop sharing that. And I need to share my command line here. I think it's this one. Yes. Okay. So this is my command line, and I have a couple of, you know, you can see this is actually running the boundary controller here. This is running my Postgres database. I just, you know, I have that up because I was running Postgres. This is just a test instance that I had. This is my worker. So you can see, you know, earlier I was messing around with some things that I was trying to get working. error dialing in, pulling connection timed out, blah, blah. These are my 3 nodes that are running a web app, and the web app that they are running is this. All this test page app does is when you connect to it with curl or with a web browser, it spits out the IP that it's running on. So what we will see when we go back here is if I already did a boundary authenticate. So if I do a boundary authenticate and I give it a boundary address and I give it my username, then it's going to spit out a token. Now, of course, that token's fairly sensitive, so I'm not going to show you what my token is, but you can either use that token in an environment variable so that the boundary CLI can use it, or the boundary CLI actually has support for several different password store, like a password manager type of things. For the Unix CLI, it just uses the standard pass if you have that set up. Now I don't, so I set it as an environment variable instead, and that's fine. But once you've authenticated and you have your boundary address and you know what your targets are, you can then connect. In this case, I'm doing a boundary connect HTTP. So what it's doing is it's connecting using, in this case, I believe it uses curl, if curl's available, and it just connects through the worker to the target. And what you'll see there is this IP here, 18.189.11.6. That is one of these instances here. I think it's actually this one. It's the worker instance, or it might be this one. But in any case, if I connect again, because I have multiple hosts, you can see I got a different address there. Likewise, if I go back far enough to my SSH in the history, let's see, TTCP, let's see, yes, this is correct. So now instead of connecting over HTTP and getting something back from a web application, I'm connecting through SSH directly to my nodes. And if I connect again, because there are multiple of these, this one is the 27.104. The next one I connect to will probably be something different. It's the 26.182. If I connect to a different target, which is the, where did it go? The boundary controller SSH target. If I SSH to that target, then I will be connected to a different and more specific host. This is my controller host here. It's a different target, it's a different host group, it's a different host. So I will stop there. If anybody has more questions or wants to see something or wants me to try something.
No, we don't need to try anything, but I'm going to follow up on my scenario from earlier. So say I have my cluster and I've got 3 server worker nodes, whatever, in the private subnet, and I know one of them is I can't, its service is marked down, but the node is still up and running. So I want to SSH onto it. Can I, your example, you're randomly getting one on the back end. Can I tell it which one I want to get to?
Yes, you can. And if we go look at, let's see, host ID. So I will pick a specific host ID out of my host catalog, and then we can see that we'll be able to connect to it over and over consistently. Where's my hosts? Okay, so here's a host ID. This is the 26.182 host, and we need to give it -host ID. And okay, so now that's the 26.182. Now if I log out and I connect to that specific host again, I keep getting the 26.182 over and over. So yeah, you can absolutely do that. Same thing applies to the web access as well, because here's a, I don't want to call it a dirty little secret, it's actually kind of cool. Underneath all of these different connection methods, it's all just TCP. So the hosts are totally generic to what you're connecting to them on. The only thing that matters in the connection is the target. So a target, one way to think of a target, it's a type of an object, if you will, in Boundary. A target is a host set plus connection parameters to the hosts in that set. And so typically that's going to be something like a port. But actually, let me flip back to my Boundary GUI, and I will show you what the targets look like, because I didn't do that before. So if I look at this app node web, there are a couple things I can set here. So with my SSH, well, actually, I'm going to go back to the SSH target because that one's probably a little more relevant for this. So if I look at my connection parameters, I can specify the maximum duration of a session. If I just need somebody to be able to SSH into something, like literally to run a single command and wait for its output to come back, and then I don't want them to do anything but, let's say they're an auditor. All they're going to do every day is they're going to log into the host, run a command that generates some audit stuff. They're going to store the output, and then they're done. It takes 30 seconds. There's no reason to give them the capability to run a persistent long-running shell, right? So I give them access to a target that'll give them, let's be generous. If they need 30 seconds, let's give them 5 minutes or so. I mean, how much damage can you do in 5 minutes on a single host, right? The point being, they can't do something like tunnel out of your network and set up a persistent reverse proxy for their buddies from a foreign state actor to now get into your network and wreak havoc. Because after 5 minutes, Boundary is going to come along and slam the door and say, nope, you're done. And then, of course, the next morning, you're going to come in and go, what were you trying to do with a reverse tunnel on my host for 5 minutes? You don't get access anymore, Mr. Auditor. In fact, while I wait for anybody else to have questions, I might see if I can set up a new target that just to demonstrate that connection slamming shut. Let's see, short SSH. Maximum duration, let's say 15 seconds. Maximum connections. Oh, that's the other thing. You can set maximum connections. So you can say, one person at a time, or 5 at a time, or you can set it to -1, and that means there's no limit. All right, so I need to add a host set, and I'll add my generic web host set. And now I should be able to, let's see, target ID. Okay, so now I'm logged in. Let's start counting off maybe a few seconds here. In the meantime, go ahead.
We can't see your shell.
Oh, you can't see the shell. Oh, hang on a sec. Yeah, I forgot. Let's see. Okay, so let me repeat that because you want to see the shell. Okay, so I set that target up for 15 seconds. So now I'm logged in, 1,000, 2, 1,000. I'm not going to count.
Come on, Joe, keep counting.
10, 1,000. Oh, see, I was counting a little slow there. And it even tells me why my session is gone. Session has expired. I'm not allowed to connect any longer than that. And now I can log back in for 15 more seconds, and then it'll kick me out. Don't go get a cup of coffee after you log in or anything, because you'll get kicked out on this connection.
Hey, Joe, we've got a question that came in for you on the chat. I'll read it.
Oh, yeah. Let me.
And it says, could I use Boundary for programmatic access? E.g., could I give GitHub access to my Jenkins instance that is behind a firewall for a webhook?
I think, I don't know if you could do that. I mean, I don't want to say you can't do that. I'm not sure in my head how that would work. You do get an auth token from Boundary. So if GitHub can pass that auth token as part of the webhook call, and if you have, yeah, I think you should be able to do that. I think you would be able to do that if you wanted to. You just have to make sure that GitHub can pass the auth token to Boundary, and I think there's a way to do that.
That's actually probably a great question. I'm not sure if everybody here is aware. There are a community site at HashiCorp called Discuss, So it's discuss.hashicorp.com. And lots of great message forums on there for all users, right? Open source and enterprise users across all the products. And if that's something that we don't know off the top of our head, I bet you there's an engineer or a user out there who might already be tinkering with something like that.
Yeah, and like I said, there was stuff I was tinkering with while I was getting this ready. One of the things I was poking at was getting this running in containers. And the ultimate goal there was to get it running in Kubernetes. So I was playing with it in EKS. One thing that I wanted to mention is if you are using a cloud, a supported cloud KMS, and if that KMS, if that cloud supports something like instance role credentials like AWS does, you can let Boundary use those instance role credentials. You don't have to do anything even. It will just pick them up if they're there to be picked up. And if those role credentials have access to the KMS keys, that's as much authentication as you need to give. If you don't have the capability to do that, or you don't want to use the instance role for access to the KMS keys in your cloud provider, you can provide it with explicit credentials in a couple of different ways too. So you have options there. The other thing that I found was, this is a little esoteric, but if you're doing stuff with this in containers like I was playing with, you may hit this. Because the container networking adds an extra network hop, AWS recently, sometime within the last year, made a change to the way that instance metadata is handled. So there's a limited number of network hops that are allowed to access the metadata. And so Docker, running inside a Docker container, adds a network hop. So you have to actually add, I forget what the metadata is. It's metadata on the instance to say, yes, it's allowed to take more hops to get to the metadata service. It's one of the instance metadata options for your instances. So I just bumped it up to 5. Time check. We got about 12 minutes left. So if anybody has any last questions, if not, I'm going to turn it back over to Larry and or Prakash.
Hey, Joe, I had a question. I was noticed you're pulling out the target IDs and the host IDs. Can you get those on the command line instead of referencing them from the UI?
You can. I did not do that just because I don't remember the command for that off the top of my head, but I believe if I do boundary -- help, I can do like targets list, targets. And as you can see, there's a whole bunch of stuff. Let's see, list.
There's also an API to pull the roles and hosts as well.
Yeah. Let's see, scope ID. The default is global. Format token name. Gave me an error. I'm not sure why, but yes, you can do that on the command line. This field is required to have a properly formatted scope ID. Oh. Okay. I think it may just need targets read. But yes, you can list them. I think you might have to provide a scope ID to do that. We actually have a walkthrough on the Boundary website that goes through. And one of the things when you're first setting it up, if you don't do anything, the way you set it up is you set up your database, you set up your KMS keys. That's before you ever do anything with Boundary. You create your Boundary config file and for the controller, and you create a config file for the worker. And then when you start the controller up, the first thing you need to do is actually give it a database init command. And what that does is it will go out to the configured database and set it up for use with Boundary. Then once you've done the database init, and that's a short process, that will eventually finish. And then once you've done that, you start up Boundary, just the Boundary server command, and then the Boundary server will start up. And it's Boundary server, whether it's a controller or a worker. And what controls which it is just the configuration in the config file. So you start up your controller, you start up your worker authenticates to your controller. And actually, if I scroll back in here, you'll be able to see where my controllers first came in. I don't know if there's a lot of log output here, but it's, yeah, okay, so yeah. So this is what it looks like when you first start up the Boundary controller. It tells you a bunch of stuff about how Boundary's configured. And then this is where you see my controller workers successfully authenticated. And then it gives you a bunch of session output. Correspondingly, over on the worker side, where's my worker output? It's over here. Yeah. So this is the worker telling me the same thing, right? The worker says, hey, I started up. I'm connected to this controller, and this is all the connections that I'm handling on behalf of clients.
Hey, Joe, I'm curious, does the Boundary server do some kind of health check on the workers to make sure they're available, or does it, like if it's down, will it tell you something that it's down, or the host targets something reachable?
I don't know if it does, because I don't know if it even really cares. It just says, okay, there's workers connected. I mean, I know it's got to do something at least, because one of the things it has to decide is which worker to tell you to connect through. And I think this is not, I don't think this is in the current release, but it's something that's coming, will be the ability to say, I want to connect to, when somebody tries to connect to this target, I want them to connect through these specific workers. And so that way you'll be able to set up, so like you have these workers that connect to this isolated portion of your environment and these other workers that connect to this other isolated portion of your environment. But your clients don't need to know any of that. All they know is I have a target that I need to connect to, and I connect to it and it does whatever it needs to do, and then there I am.
Right.
So there's got to be something like that, but I don't know what the extent of it is.
And in this example, you're using AWS key management. Like, how different is it to do it with Vault?
It's not too much different with Vault. With Vault, you'd be using the transit engine, and then what you would do is you would provide the Vault address. You don't have to provide an address for AWS because it just uses the public endpoints. You provide your Vault credentials, whatever they are. Usually that might be something like a token. And you tell it where the keys are that it's going to use. So just like with AWS KMS, you give it the KMS key ID in the config. With Vault, you tell it where the key is mounted and what the key name is.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Anybody else? I saw Larry. I saw your mic blip there.
Joe, this was great info. This was definitely immensely helpful for me. I've not been able to really dive deep into the Boundary product yet. I've been through a lot of our high-level material. I've yet to install it on my machine, so this is really going to help jumpstart me. And
also,
quickly.
I've been running it in Docker on these things, because that way you don't have to worry about SCPing the Boundary binary to every host you want to run on. As long as you have Docker installed, you just run it. That is just HashiCorp/Boundary, and the current release as of yesterday morning, I think, was 0.1.4. I don't think there's been a new release since then, so just know that that's the latest release available. There's boundaryproject.io. There's a GitHub project as well. By all means, please go do stuff, file issues. Feel free to contribute to documentation. It's very fertile ground right now because it's such a new product.
Just a couple quick points, if I may, before everybody heads out the door, just to kind of wrap things up. I know we're a few minutes over on time. If anybody has any lingering questions, I'm sure Joe will stick around for a few if you want to put something out there that maybe you didn't want to ask with the larger audience. But thank you for Joe for his presentation. This is definitely helpful for everybody here, I hope. Certainly myself. As we build up sponsors, we'll have more thank yous for sponsors. And of course, we really need everybody's input who is here. If you're intending to come back for another session next month, hopefully, I know we've been bantering whether we do this every month or every other month. Ultimately, it's your decision. You're the community members. We want you to decide. And we want to make sure that we are presenting meaningful material to you, or letting you present meaningful material. So maybe you have something that you've been working on, that you've been hacking on. Maybe you've got halfway and you need help with it, right? We can have hack days, we can have workshops, we can have tips and tricks, right? We could talk about things that have nothing to do with HashiCorp. They could talk about the ecosystem that HashiCorp tools work in. So maybe you've got a Circle CI difficulty, or maybe you're working with a configuration management tool that interacts with some things in the HashiCorp ecosystem. These are all fair game. Bring them forward. But I do not want to necessarily digress into like whole DevOps discussions, because we've got a meetup group for that sort of thing. So just not step on toes, if you will. But at the end of the day, your input, please share it, whether it be in Slack or meetup messaging. Let us know so that we can make this useful for you. And let's see. Thank you for being here. Thank you for participating. We'll keep the session running for a few minutes till you guys filter out in case there are last questions. But with that, thank you